Hey, what's up, everybody? In this lesson, I'm going to give you 5 tips you can use on your springtime landscape photographs to elevate color, introduce lighting, and bring those spring images to life inside of On1 Photo Raw. Let's dive in and take a look. So let's start with my first tip, and that is to pop individual colors using the color enhancer filter in On1 Photo Raw. One of the biggest problems I encounter, and I see a lot of times in photo editing when you're dealing with spring landscapes, is that you want to just make one individual color stand out so that you can increase saturation, you can increase brightness. You want the viewer to focus in on that one individual color. So it's really easy to accomplish that with the color enhancer filter. In On1 Photo Raw, we're just going to go into the Effects tab. I'll add a filter, and I'll use color enhancer. Now at the very bottom of color enhancer, and I'm just going to actually close up these little panes here so we can just focus in on this one section. We have this color range section. Say that 5 times fast. So we have this color range section here, and we can use this to grab individual colors. We can modify their hue, their saturation, and their brightness. Now you can choose individual colors here. So for example, if I want to just make my yellow stand out, I can click on yellow. I can increase the saturation, and I can modify the brightness really easily to make that one individual color stand out within the scene. Now you can also modify the range. So if it's targeting too many yellow tones and you want to pick a more exact yellow color, you can modify that range here to fine-tune where this adjustment is being applied to. Now you can also go into this little section here and use this color dropper to actually pick an individual color. So I'm going to choose adjust saturation here, and I'm going to click on this, and I'm actually going to dive into this little area here where it has this nice little red and pinkish color. I can click and drag to the left and right and modify the saturation that way. I can also do the same thing with brightness. So if you're not sure which color you're trying to modify, you can always grab that little color dropper there to go in and adjust the brightness, saturation, or the hue as needed. And that way, within your color enhancer, you've already tackled a few of these different colors so that your individual colors that you want to stand out within your scene are exactly how you want them to look. Now I've pulled up on these sliders quite a bit, so you get a little bit of these haloed edges going on. But keep in mind, this is a demo, so I want you to be able to see what I'm doing. You can always modify the opacity here to adjust the strength, or you can actually just lower those sliders down as well. My next tip is to use the glow filter to add in a soft, dreamy contrast into your springtime landscapes. So if we have this image here, it's, very one tone, but it has these nice bits of light inside of it. But if we go in here and we pull up on our midtones and we add in contrast, it looks okay, but we can really elevate the look of this by using a soft, dreamy glow. So let's go into Effects. I'll add a filter. We're just going to use Glow. And one of my favorite styles is Darker. And right out of the gate, you can see by bringing in that dreamy contrast, it just elevates the look of that springtime photo. Now, if I were you, I'd go into this More menu and check out all of the other glows that come along with this glow filter. One of my favorites is Charge More Strong. If I just turn this up and on here, with that one filter, it's doing a whole lot to elevate the contrast and vibe of the springtime landscape here. But feel free to dive into any of these and see what works for the image that you're adjusting. Another tip for spring landscapes is to use local adjustments to intentionally paint in light into your scene to create directional light, or you can darken certain areas with local adjustments to make your image a bit more interesting. So with this waterfall photograph here, I like the lighting already, but this is the original capture, and I think we could use local adjustments either to darken certain areas or to brighten certain areas to make the image more interesting. Let's start with just darkening some areas in our photo. I'm going to go into local adjustments. I'm going to grab a brush for my adjustment. We'll just use darken here, add in a little contrast, and I'm just going to use this masking brush to darken the areas that are already a bit dark. And if you need to clean anything up, you can always switch to erase to remove any that you've added in extra and you want to remove. But already with this local adjustment, it's just making things just a bit more interesting because you're adding in pops of light into the scene rather than having everything illuminated. So that's one of my favorite ways to build a scene, is just to paint in some dark and local adjustments into the areas that are already shadowed. But let's say you have a darker image. So I'm just going to go into develop, and obviously this is the original photo, but let's just say the image is a bit darker. We captured it a bit darker. Maybe something like this. What I would typically do here is I would try to emulate directional light. So I could go into local adjustments. I could grab a gradient mask. I'll use lighten. And I'll place this in an area that I think would be interesting to bring the light into. Maybe coming in from this top right corner. So I'll position this, maybe feather it out a bit. Add in a little bit more light. And you can see already it's becoming a bit more of an interesting capture. Now the great thing with masking in Photo Raw is you can always add in a brush into the gradient that you're using. So I'll just grab my masking brush, and I'll paint this same light into the right side of that waterfall. So now we have this nice directional light coming in from this top right corner, and it's illuminating the waterfall here, while leaving these other areas a bit darkened. Again, just creating a bit more of an interesting capture there, rather than having the entire scene illuminated. Pair this with a glow filter, and you got a really nice, captivating spring edit. My next tip is to add in detail into specific colors using a color range mask. Now, some folks, when it comes to editing spring landscapes, they have flowers in the foreground. You may just have a specific color in your foreground that you want to enhance with a bit of detail. And the great thing about using the dynamic contrast filter is you can use the vibrant slider to also enhance color as well as that detail. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go in here and target just this foreground section of color with the dynamic contrast filter using a color range mask. So I'll add a filter, I'll add dynamic contrast, and I'm just going to go into my styles here. I'm going to use surreal just so that we can really see what's going on. And I'm also going to pull up on the vibrance quite a bit. Now keep in mind, this is being applied to the entire image here. If I turn this off and on, it's being applied everywhere. But we can grab our masking properties here. I'm going to just open up my left panel, and I have my masking properties over here on the left. And I'm going to create a color range mask. So I'm going to go to More, and I'll click on Color Range. Now by default, the color range mask is going to protect the color that you have selected. But it's not a big deal. We can always just invert that after the fact. So I'm just going to use my little color dropper here. I'll click it on this purplish blue color in my foreground. Now keep in mind again, it's going to protect that color. So in my mask, it's not actually applying anything really anywhere. But if we invert that mask and pull back on the color range, you can see we can get a little bit more specific on where that color is being applied to. So now we're applying all of that dynamic contrast filter into that specific color of the scene while avoiding those other colors. Now keep in mind, you can always modify that color. So I've chosen a little bit more of a blue, but if you want to pick more of that purple color, you can just use that color dropper here and pick more of the purpley color within the scene there. So if I turn this off and on here, we're targeting that specific color while avoiding the rest of the colors within the image. Now, the great thing about using masks inside of On1 Photo Raw is we can actually remove this from this top section if we don't want it applied to the mountain. I'm just going to grab my gradient mask tool. I'm going to go in my mask layers. I'll click on gradient mask, and I'll just pull this up, modify the feathering here. And now if I view my mask, you can see we're just targeting that specific color within our foreground section here. So if I turn this off and on, it's doing a great job of enhancing the colors within that section. And then if I need to, I can modify the color range to make it less or more strong there. So that's a really easy way to bring in detail and color into a specific area using the color range mask. Another tip I have for springtime landscapes is to use a reflected gradient to create a bit of light within the center of your scene. Now this is great for landscapes like this, where we just have, essentially a pretty dull landscape here, but we can elevate this by adding in light into the central section of the photo. We can darken the bottom and then the top. This will give us a really nice lighting within the middle of the photo. And it's also going to darken the sky, which will bring in some nice stormy, moody vibes. And we can increase the color of this middle section to increase saturation and just enhance the look of the scene. So let's say we just are starting out with a photo like this. What I would typically do is I'd probably pull up on my midtones, shadows, add in quite a bit of contrast, maybe some saturation here. But you can see everything's looking pretty, one tone. There's not really anything going on. So let's go into our local adjustments. I'll add in a gradient mask here. Now with my gradient mask, by default it's set to the shape gradient, but I'm going to go up to the top and choose reflected gradient. That way the mask is being applied to the top and the bottom. So I'm just going to position this. We can always modify that positioning later. And then I'm going to pull back on the exposure quite a bit. Add in contrast, maybe a little bit of white there. And I'm also going to cool the temperature down a hair. Now already we're getting a little bit more of an interesting feel within our scene here. I can pull down on this section there. Even pull up on this section here and modify that feathering. Adjust the position as needed. And already it's a lot more of an interesting photo. Let's check out the original and after. And then you could go in and maybe style with a glow filter like we did in the earlier one to give it a little bit more of a dreamy, soft look. Play around maybe with a photo filter to give it a little bit more color. I really like warming these images up. Now, the world is your oyster once you've sort of created that light within the scene there. But you can see how using that reflected gradient does a great job of keeping the light within that sort of center of the frame there. And it makes it a lot more of an interesting, eye-catching image versus just having it to, sort of one tone there. So those are 5 tips I like to use in my springtime edits. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next lesson. And remember, if you're an On1 Plus member, you get all of these tutorials and more. You get exclusive tutorials, tip videos, courses, remix challenges, On1 Plus editing guides, and much, much more. Become an On1 Plus member today to get the most out of your On1 Photo Raw experience.